Good evening, welcome to another Hot Topic where we discuss the issues of the day affecting the people of East Yorkshire and Northern Lincolnshire. And tonight I'm joined by Roy Horrobin, who stood for the Liberal Democrats in the last general election for Cleethorpes and Immingham, and who stood for a councillor on North East Lincolnshire Council for the Croft Baker ward in May and was unsuccessful both times. Roy, forgive me for rubbing it in, but senior Liberal Democrat here nevertheless. Before we move on to the main order of business, which I suppose has to be the European Union, I just want to talk about the results of that last general election this time last year. The Liberal Democrats got 7.9% of the vote and only 8 seats. The Scottish National Party got a little more than half that number of votes at 4.7% of the vote and got 56 seats. And conversely, the UKIP got almost twice as many votes as you did, 12.7% of the vote, and got only 1 seat. Do we live in a democracy?
We do live in a democracy, but we don't live in a perfect democracy.
Well, it's either one thing or another, isn't it? Either the representative democracy is representative of the way those who are governed, the electorate, voted, or it's not. And this seems to be an appalling distortion that the House of Commons does not represent the way that we voted a year ago.
I would still stick with that we live in a democracy. And I think, and I'm really anxious to talk about Europe, and I think what's going on with Europe illustrates that we definitely have freedom of speech. We have a problem with our electoral system, and I think it's quite interesting. The Police and Crime Commissioner approach was not first past the post, and clearly in the way devolution, the way the elections have been set up, clearly there is a general acceptance that our system's not right, but a reluctance of the Conservative Party, I almost said older, but of course we're much older than the Labour Party, a reluctance of the Conservative Party in particular and Labour Party, I think, to change the system because they're worried about being disadvantaged. It would have been a very different House of Commons, wouldn't it, if we'd had a form of proportional representation, whichever system.
But there was a possibility when you were, the Liberal Democrats were in coalition with the Conservatives in the last Parliament. One of their conditions for that coalition was that there was a referendum in 2011 on the AV system of proportional representation. And this is the democratic paradox. In that democratic referendum, 68% of the people decided that they'd stay with the less representative system.
Yes, I agree. It's quite strange, isn't it? And it is quite frustrating, but that was the democratic outcome. That they didn't want a more democratic system in terms of voting. And I think there's a massive issue in that first past the post is what we've had and is easy to understand. And I know my daughter's going through A-level politics, and she's been explaining she's been explaining various electoral systems to me. And I was asking about one of them, and she said, the problem is the system in Northern Ireland is the most democratic, but nobody understands it. And I've tried to explain the D'Hondt system about how MEPs are elected to people, only to have to go to YouTube to check they're very complex, aren't they? So that's the problem. Well, but we need to persist with that. There is a problem.
We'll talk about the referenda in a moment, because referenda tend to be rather on our mind at the moment. But before that, let's just talk about where the Liberal Democratic Party is locally and nationally, and internationally indeed. It's been disastrous the last 12 months. You have only 8 members of Parliament in the House of Commons, only 5 members in the Scottish Parliament, 1 member each in the European Parliament and in the Welsh Assembly, and there are 20,252 local councillors in England and Wales, of which you have only 1,809. It's been a terrible, terrible time, hasn't it, for the Liberal Democrats?
And you know I'm going to say no.
Well, I don't think you can deny it, Roy, can you?
I can certainly strongly counter-argue that. The electoral result of the general election, which seems so long ago now, was definitely a massive blow, a massive disaster. Going down to 8 seats. But the funny thing is, very quickly, in fact immediately, there was this sense. I remember going to the conference in York, and there just isn't this sense of being humiliated and destroyed as a party.
But are you in denial?
Liberalism. No, because one of the things, of course, is that liberalism, the concepts, the ideas of liberalism are very strong. And as a party, what we've done is we've gone down to a very small number in terms of MPs. But, for example, locally, our membership has doubled. Our membership has really soared. In the last election, I was unsuccessful, but we had two other people who weren't unsuccessful. We've gone up, it was only 3, we are at only 5, but we are creeping up.
This is on North East
Yes,
Lincolnshire
North East
Council.
Lincolnshire Council,
Yeah.
sorry. So, and I would predict that at the next election we will be more successful. We've got a problem. We just don't have the same amount of funds when it comes to general elections as what the Conservative Party do, what the Labour Party do, and probably even what UKIP had. So that is a disadvantage. But we are good campaigners, and we are cohesive. So no, I am not in denial. It's not a disaster.
People tend to vote, even in local elections, along national party lines. They'll associate
Yeah.
themselves with the national
Okay.
party, rather than, sadly, rather than the individual local
Yeah.
councillors. Tim Farron, as your new leader,
Yes.
is hardly visible at all now. This may be the fault of the media, not S3 TV, but other media for not giving him any exposure. But he doesn't seem to be popping his head above the parapet quite as often as Nick Clegg did, obviously, as Deputy Prime Minister, or as his predecessors, as poor old Charles Kennedy or Ming
Yeah.
Candle might have done.
Yes, and I would blame the media. So
Well,
yeah, I'd say a simple answer.
I wasn't holding my hands up there. That's
No,
not necessarily the case. It's,
No, I'm saying it is, and I'm very emphatic about that. I was starting to have, I probably shouldn't air these doubts, but I was starting to have doubts about Tim Farron because I thought, hold on, this guy, I've heard great reviews about him, but I don't really know much about him. And I went off to the York conference, and because it was relatively local, and he spoke, and I thought, yes, he is a brilliant speaker. And yes, he is all the things that people have said about him. I think he is. I think he's great. And I think he is the best leader there is of a British parliamentary party. But you've got to be given exposure, and he is not being given that exposure. And I've now seen him on various programmes, and I thought, yeah, he comes across really well, but I am blaming the media. Yeah, I'm really emphatic about that.
Okay, well, I make no confession or admission.
We could always
along
ask
those
him to
lines.
come here, couldn't
We will. I doubt that he would come this far. Well, we'll try. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
We'll try to get him on. Let's get back to this idea of referenda. We have had a referendum on the alternative vote system in 2011. We had a referendum in Scotland a couple of years ago about independence. We're now having the European referendum. Is it a good idea that we have suddenly all these referendum and a direct democracy when quite clearly in the AV thing you found that direct democracy rather distressing?
Yes, it is. And there is a very real chance, I am emphatically, in case anybody's in any doubt, in favour of staying in. And I'm really happy to explore that from a very local angle.
That's what we'll do with the rest of the program.
Yeah. So, yeah, we've... sorry, I've gone... Hugh, what did you say?
Well, I'm just suggesting that the idea that we're having all these referenda, in 5 years
yes,
we've
of
had 3
course,
referenda, that's an awful lot of direct democracy and quite different to our usual traditions of politics.
Yeah, sorry, I digressed in order to make the point that, yes, I think it's a good idea, and there is a very real chance that this could be lost. And I'm so in favour of staying in, but there's a very real chance that we could suddenly be out of the European Union. This project that began early in the 1970s, not long after I was born, that with the clicking of fingers that could all disappear. But yes, it is important, because what it's doing is it's getting people talking about issues. And yes, there's all sorts of misinformation. That's always going to happen. So in terms of coming back to the idea of democracy, I feel a very healthy democratic process is going on right now with the sort of discussion that is going on all over the place about the referendum.
The Liberal Democrats are possibly the only party that is, of the old traditional 3 parties anyway, that is not divided. The Conservatives and the Labour Party are both clearly divided across, and this whole issue of in or out is crossing those traditional party axes, as it were. The Liberal Democrats, there are very few Liberal Democrats who'd want to come out.
Correct.
What is it about Liberal Democrat philosophy that is so coherent or correlates so closely to the idea of the European Union?
Well, I think what it boils down to is it's about being outward looking, I keep hearing that expression, and wanting to work with people. The European Union is far from perfect, but we need to be in there leading it rather than leaving it. And again, you only have to, just Angela Merkel the other day saying how, this argument I keep hearing locally that, look, it's not going to make a difference. Europe's still going to want to trade with us. It's really not going to make a difference. Well, yesterday she said, yeah, it will. So we can't tell the Europeans how to react. The message is coming through very clearly. Leave, it's going to make things difficult. I don't think they'll be deliberately spiteful, but it is going to make things difficult. I think it is going to be negative. And I think there's something I don't know. Lib Dems are very much in favour of free speech. So I think we've thought it through and we're approaching this from a rational point of view.
Roy, we'll come back to that and we'll talk for the second half. I think we'll devote to the
Okay.
European Union. But for the moment, we must go for a break. Please join us again after this short break. Welcome back. I'm still in the studio with Roy Horobin. Roy, you mentioned before that you found reasons for staying in the EU entirely locally here in North East Lincolnshire, here on the banks of the Humber.
Yes, well, we are, Grimsby is a port, Immingham is a port, Hull is a port. We need to trade with Europe. But the big thing for me is the renewables industry. I don't think that would have come to our area had it not have been for the EU. And I think if we leave the EU, that's in threat, and I'm very happy to develop that idea.
Well, the point is that the renewables industry is here because that's where the wind is blowing on the North Sea and close to ports that are on the Humber that can service that industry. Now, membership of the European Union is not necessary to making the wind blow in the North Sea.
No, it isn't. But the whole theory, sort of the whole idea of climate, there is a certain climate that the EU has created. It's very much pro-environment, and that's very sympathetic to renewables. And also the Lib Dems in the last government were very sympathetic and really pushed this issue. I don't think it would have come here without that. But it's that outward-looking attitude of Lib Dems in government and that combination of looking towards Europe. And again, if we're going to solve our energy problems, what we need is actually not just a national grid, we need a European grid. So we need to be sending solar power up to the north of Europe. We need to be sending wind power when it's in excess down to the south of Europe. So our future solutions for green, cheaper energy are a European collaborative approach.
Renewable energy is clearly the industry for the Humber that it's going to rely on in the future. Dangerous enough to be relying on one industry only, though, as that is.
And then just to keep going then, so what we need to do is trade. And what I'm really worried about, there keeps being this sort of Project Fear allegation thrown at people like me. But we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen if we leave the EU. But what could easily happen is that tariffs could go back up. So for us as a trading nation, which of course all nations have to be, there's a massive potential danger there. And there are so many jobs tied in. And I know there's areas of the country, just looking at it from a narrow North East Lincolnshire, East Yorkshire point of view, there are factories in Derby. Well, if those factories shut, and there's a good chance they will, the factories at the car factories, the Nissan, I don't even know which car manufacturers it is, but I do know they've located in Britain because it's part of the EU. We leave the EU, the pressure will be they need to shift that manufacturing into somewhere like Germany or Holland or somewhere like that. Well, again, those people visit Cleethorpes, visit our part, and we're interconnected with them as well. So
the only car factory I can think of located in Derby is Rolls-Royce.
No, there's
Rolls-Royce's market is more likely to be in China now than it is within the European Union.
That's very true.
And so those manufacturers and those trading places are going to be just as dependent on places far, far away from Europe as they are on anything across the Channel.
Which is another argument that being in the EU does not exclude us from trading with China or other places like that, but it strengthens our hand. And coming back to the point about a single industry, no, there's no way we should. I'm an enormous fan of the renewables industry. It affects the supply chain, but we only have to look back to the fishing industry and the over-reliance upon one industry there. We don't want to repeat that. We need more manufacturing. Well, if we need more manufacturing, we need to be trading that manufacturing without tariffs. So I'm thinking very much of the future.
Well, just going back to the past then, I mean, renewables for the future, the one industry we relied on here in the past was, as you say, the fishing industry. There are many in Grimsby and Hull who would say that it was the European Union and the common fisheries policy that destroyed the fishing industries in Hull and Grimsby.
Yeah, and I'd completely agree. Same as I would agree that Adolf Hitler was a terrible leader, because everybody's been banging on about Hitler, haven't they? So I might as well join them.
I thought we could avoid him in this interview, but never mind.
No, but also the relevant point is that I wouldn't still blame Germany for that particular conflict. And also, that was a disastrous policy that was ill thought out and really unfair. There was an issue with the fishing industry in that that level of fishing was unsustainable, but that needed dealing with in a much more sensible, fairer, humane way. But also the argument that I've heard about that was I think the EU got it wrong, but that was a long time ago. The new EU policy on fishing is really, really good, and it's environmentally friendly, and also it would benefit.
This is not
a
throwing
British
away fish that are already
Yeah,
dead.
not just that, but also it's about it's about an exclusion zone around Britain just for British ships. So it would favour, and again, if we actually stay in the EU and decide to argue for the British fishing industry, and UKIP haven't really done that. They haven't attended the meetings. That's well documented, isn't it? There hasn't been this advocacy. And again, David Cameron and various other people have not been there in Europe arguing for Britain. So we'll never go back to the same level of fishing. But we could have a sustainable, good fishing industry that also acted as a tourism industry for our area of Grimsby. So that would be, but I'm thinking of manufacturing and the need to trade.
Well, let's move off the economy and
Okay.
just we were talking earlier on about democracy and how difficult that can be. The European institutions, the institutions of the European Union are not very democratic. The only one that's elected directly is the European Parliament, which is a toothless tiger, largely. The rules that govern the European Union tend to be initiated in the Commission, which is an unelected bunch of people appointed, one for each member state of the European Union.
Yeah.
And the Council of Ministers is a sort of negotiating talking shop, almost like a kind of a Senate, where each country has a member on the Council of Ministers, regardless of whether or not that country has 80 million people in it or 3 million people in it. So that's not a very democratic representation either. The way that the European Union is governed in its institutions, the more power you give it, the more power you're giving to a much less democratic form of government than there might be in the nation states.
Yes, I'm not entirely sure what your question is here.
Well, the question is that if you're trying to support democracy, as you have, and you're
Yeah.
a fan of these referenda, that if you're giving more power to an undemocratic or a less democratic
Yes.
creature like the European Union, because so little of it has democratic responsibility to those it governs, then is that not in itself an undemocratic move?
No, I don't think it's undemocratic. I think there are problems with the EU and democracy. And again, I think there is a need to reform that. And I think that's possible, but you need to be in there engaging. And the main way you shape things is by negotiating with people. But coming back to the democracy, it's so relevant, and tying it in locally again. You know, when I'm in St Peter's Avenue, Cleethorpes, or wherever it happens to be, I don't look and think, thank goodness for Westminster politics. Because actually, I think Westminster politics is not really looking after the north of England, and it's not looking after Cleethorpes, Grimsby, Hull, the East Riding. I don't think it's doing a great job. The House of Lords is unelected. The first past the post system is a terrible problem. So I think we've got problems there.
Well, just point out the Liberal Democrats have far more members of the House of Lords than they do members of the House of Commons.
Yeah, and also they're in favour of getting rid of the official policy, although I'm not entirely in agreement with this, is to move away from the House of Lords because it's undemocratic. Whereas it seems to me that, and this ties into Europe, that actually the House of Lords, it tends to a point, we have, we've got life peers, hereditary peers have disappeared. You tend to get appointed to the House of Lords very competent people who take the job very seriously and are unburdened by the problem of being elected.
Well, in that case, if that's a merit, let's move away from the House of Lords and back to Europe. If
Yeah,
that's a
I'm very happy
merit,
to do
then the same thing goes for instance, members of the European Commission, who are very competent, no doubt the best that their nations can provide. It's a job that requires a great deal of intellectual activity, and yet they too are not burdened by this necessity to be populists, this temptation to be demagogues that elected democratic politicians must endure. So perhaps that's a merit, the absence of democracy, and the fact that there's a degree of meritocracy there. Is that not an argument in favour?
I would slightly alter what you're saying, but broadly speaking, you have made my argument. This obsession with the European Commission, which is a tiny body, much smaller than Whitehall in terms of its size, its capacity, and its
The European
influence.
bureaucracy is about the size and employs about the same number of people as the town council of Reading in Berkshire.
You see, I haven't heard that figure,
medium-sized
but-
town.
right, okay.
I make that point
But-
to emphasise how small it is, not to suggest that
Yes,
it's...
yes, I realise that. I hadn't heard that particular. But again, it's small and it's for all of Europe. And what I'm also in favour of, I'm worried now I'm going off in too many different directions. I'm actually in favour of more local decision making.
Well, let's stay with the democratic
And
direction.
I'll stick with the democratic thing then. So the European Commission, they are not elected, no. But I don't think that what's come out of that, but then it gets checked. And let's face it, who is appointing these people? It's the leaders of countries. So the democracy, it's an indirect form of democracy.
Just very quickly, one more
Okay.
point, Roy. Liberalism is a sophisticated philosophy that is independent entirely of nations. Does it matter where we put when we surrender our freedom, when we're governed as individuals, does it matter where we put that sovereignty?
Yes, it does. And it has to be discussed, and it has to be decided, and it has to be voted on.
Roy, thank you very much. I think that's a tragically short discussion about the European Union, but thank you so much for coming
Okay.
in. Join me again next week. That's it for today's Hot Topic. Just time to remind you about a Hot Topic special discussing the EU referendum, which will take place at Grimsby Institute on Thursday, the 16th of June at 7:30. My guests will include Melanie Orne, Martin Vickers and Victoria Ailing. If you'd like to be part of the audience or have any questions for the panel, please get in touch in the usual ways. Look forward to hearing from you. Until next week's Hot Topic, goodbye.